Beyond the gate, spoilers tease that Kat recognizes, with an almost devastating clarity, that her relationship with Tomas has quietly unraveled. It is less an epiphany than a slow, cold dawning one evening after the first time they moved together in the thin anonymity of a rented room, after they'd traded curiosity for mechanics and curiosity dissolved into polite fatigue. She sat on the edge of the bed and felt the shape of disappointment like a foreign language. The room smelled faintly of shampoo and stale coffee. Outside, the streetlights painted the blinds in slow bands of light. Tomas, who had been gentle and eager in small, endearing ways, slept a breath away with the innocence of someone who had not noticed the shift. Kat watched the rise and fall of his chest and for the first time wondered which of the two of them had been playing a part all along. She had imagined more fire, mythic reconnection, some private revolution that would change the dull architecture of her weeks. Instead, the first encounter felt like a rehearsal for a life she no longer wanted. It wasn't that Tomas was cruel or absent. He was simply small in the precise places she had hoped to find an echo. He was a man who loved patterns and predictability, the same coffee shop at 9, the same jokes, the same cautious hands. Where she had craved luminosity, he offered routine. In bed, he asked the right questions and offered the safe answers, and Kat discovered she could not fake delight at the sound of his contentment. The intimacy they reached was clinical rather than ecstatic, a tidy exchange of signals rather than a collision. At nearly the same time, Eva arrived on the edges of their lives like a bright, disruptive color. Not related by blood, she was Kat's cousin's friend, or so the rumor went, but she had the kind of presence that bent light. Eva's laughter was discordant, unexpected. It made Tomas listen. She wore hunger like an accessory, a quick, knowing smile, a foot that tapped when she was impatient, and there were moments when Tomas looked at her and something loosened in him. It was not just attraction, it was relief, as though Eva offered him a permission to be more than the safe man he tried to be with Kat. Kat noticed it in the smallest inconsistencies: the way Tomas's voice softened when Eva entered a room, the way he paused when she told a story, the quick, culpable looks between them. It was a betrayal that arrived in fragments, as betrayals often do, not explosive but cumulative. The first time she saw them together, she forced a smile and told herself she was imagining the heat in Tomas's stare. Later, alone in her apartment, she practiced listing the ways she was justified in feeling wounded. She was not possessive, she told herself. She was simply more honest than complicit. But honesty can be a sharp and lonely medicine. It clarifies, and then it asks you what you will do with the clarification. Meanwhile, an undercurrent complicated everything. Leslie, Kat's cousin, was missing, an absence that had the smell of danger. Kat had been searching for Leslie with a single-mindedness that made everything else in her life feel incidental. Leslie wasn't merely a missing person, she was a repository of history. A string of half-explanations and old sorrows that Kat could not leave untied. The search became an obsession. Kat slept less, crossed neighborhoods with folded flyers and questions that met dead ends, and learned how to sharpen patience into a tool for prying secrets loose. In the back of her head, the search made relationships brittle. There is something about grief and relentless worry that hardens the edges of ordinary interaction. Small betrayals feel like knives because you are already raw. During those long nights and empty coffee hours, Tomas, despite his professed support for Kat, began edging toward Eva as if pulled by something simple and inexorable. He knew, as the viewer senses he must, the complex history between the two women, the skeletons in their shared closet, the depths of loyalty, the wounded memories that made the word trust an ember ready to die. But Tomas was willing to reach for Eva anyway. He smiled at her in ways that were private and tender. He agreed to help her with matters that, at face value, related to Leslie. That agreement was the pivot of the problem. Instead of standing beside Kat in her frantic, fragile role, he chose to stand with someone who was, at least currently, an agent of complication. Tomas's help with things concerning Leslie was ambiguous, neither noble nor transparently evil. It took the shape of favors that were plausible, running errands, making calls, checking anonymous tips. But each favor felt like a vote placed in a kindness that favored Eva. Kat watched this alignment with a growing suspicion. If Leslie was missing, Why did Thomas seem to be investing his energies where Eva asked rather than where Kat pleaded? The answer was small and humiliating and human. Thomas was drawn to Eva's danger, and to the lightness in her voice when she spoke of matters that made Kat's jaw clench. Where Kat's search was heavy and haunted, Eva's approach was improvisational, and that improvisation made Thomas feel vital. There was also the question of whether Eva and Thomas had slept together. Rumor, as it often does, moved faster than fact. In shadowed corners of bars and in whispered messages, the possibility became a fact by repetition. Kat would not let herself believe it at first. Believing would make the wound too clean. But there were facts she couldn't avoid: a lipstick on a collar, a message glimpsed on a phone, a stranger's offhand comment. Each hint was a bead on a string that was beginning to look like a narrative she had not chosen but was now forced to inhabit. The truth, if truth is an absolute thing in human affairs, was messy. Thomas did not confess, and Eva did not boast. The possibility, however, had weight. It made everything smell of betrayal. Watching Thomas, Kat tried to dispassionately parse his psychology. Thomas had always been a man inclined to order and to climbing. Worked for Bill, a figure who sat somewhere in the upper echelons of local power. Bill's ambition was obvious: he wanted Vernon's recognition, a formal nod that would catapult his faction into legitimacy. Thomas, who took his cues from those above him, followed Bill's lead. That direction meant Thomas was a man who measured success in allegiances and knees bent at the right time. When Bill pushed toward a confrontation with Dupree, a rival whose appetite for dominance seemed sociopathic, Thomas was the man Bill used to test waters. He was the lieutenant who would make the move and hope it did not end in ruin. Standing up to Dupree would be a brave game, even for men who had no love for the kinds of compromises power often requires. Thomas considered it the right thing, perhaps because Bill asked it, perhaps because he wanted a place at the table, but the choice had personal consequences as well. Confronting Dupree would put him in the center of a collision in which loyalties would be tested, people would need to choose sides, and the female relationships in his life would become tactical variables rather than purely emotional ones. Thomas could not know, or perhaps he did but did not want to acknowledge, that stepping into that arena meant taking a gamble that could cost him more than territory or respect. Kat theorized about this too. She sat in the small kitchen she had once imagined would be a place for family dinners and made lists of possible outcomes. She understood the logic of Thomas's maneuvers and resented it with a clarity that burned. He was working for Bill, she told herself. He was a foot soldier in a war of egos and alliances. But people matter. His choices folded into the emotional ledger between them. When he bowed to Bill and turned away from her pleas when he lent his support to Eva's request, she didn't only align politically, he aligned morally against her. Kat felt the betrayal not just as the loss of a lover but as a footnote in a larger narrative where she did not want to be trivialized. Eva, for her part, was both careless and meticulous. She wore her power like an accessory, sometimes casual, sometimes used. She spoke to Thomas with a frankness that made him look like he'd had a sip of warm alcohol. The air between them vibrated with unspoken possibilities. Where Kat's love for Thomas had been earnest in its expectation of reciprocity, she gave freely and expected mutual care. Eva's interactions with him were transactional without being cynical. She offered him a mirror in which he could see a different self, daring, admired, more dangerous. It is easy to forget, when watching these events unfold, that people often choose comfort and escape in ways that are not deliberate betrayals but a search for a life that feels more alive. For Thomas, Eva represented that life. One of the most painful things for Kat was how Thomas hid his disappointment in her. He learned, with a kind of clumsy skill, to smooth his face into a look that said everything was fine. His eyes, bright and honest eyeshade, started averting from hers when she spoke of despair and hope. The avoidance stung more than any open scorn. A man who refuses to look at your pain is a man who cannot hold you in your totality. Thomas, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of some shame, attempted to leave the harder conversations half finished. He would laugh too quickly, change the subject, or suggest practical measures as if logistics could attend to sorrow. It was a form of emotional evasion that left Kat alone in rooms that had once felt like sanctuaries. As Kat's search for Leslie intensified, The practicalities of life thinned. She slept little. She ignored calls. Her friends few. Good trade to anchor her with food, with late-night rides through neighborhoods that held no answers. But the grip of not knowing created a mythology. What if Leslie had been taken deliberately? What if she had wanted to disappear? What if she had run with someone who promised newness in exchange for loyalty? Each theory was like a knife, and Kat turned them over like currency. She could not afford the luxury of denial. There was a practical urgency in every suspicion. Thomas's divided loyalties hurt not because he had been unfaithful in a cinematic way but because his energies were not where they were needed. That he was willing to help Eva, whose involvement with Leslie was itself ambiguous, felt like a betrayal by proxy. Thomas's confrontation with Dupree was another axis of tension. Dupree was not a mere rival. He was the kind of man who refused the pale compromises others accepted. His presence in the city was a shadow that influenced boardrooms, bars, and bedrooms. Dupree spoke in the language of inevitability. He believed in power the way some people believe in prayer. Standing up to him required not only courage but an audacity Kat could not admire and envy at once. It demanded that Thomas choose the shape of his future. Whether he would be a man who aimed for power by politicking or a man who placed human bones before rank. Kat watched Thomas with a frustrated clarity. If Thomas chose the fight with Dupree simply because Bill wanted it, what did that say of his sense of himself? Was he so eager for recognition that he would risk the things that made life tolerable: friendships, trust, a woman's faith in him for the promise of a seat at a table? This question clawed at Kat in the loneliest moments. The answer seemed to be written in his actions. He was willing to move against Dupree. He was willing, in other words, to risk. That risk became visible in small acts. Thomas started arriving home late. He took calls in the kitchen and walked into corners to speak. He became less certain in the small rescues he had once offered: picking up groceries, helping with photocopies. He moved like a man who felt the scales shifting beneath his feet. Kat, who had been trying to balance the catastrophic litany of a missing relative and the ache of a failing romance, felt herself pushed against the wall. The world was not going to be simple or kind, and she had to decide how to act in the absence of the people she thought she could rely upon. There was also the social calculus of the household. Bill, who had a way of speaking like a general, expected loyalty and rewarded usefulness. Thomas was his obedient instrument. Bill could not make Vernon recognize his worth. Vernon, a figure of inscrutable taste and private judgments, had not yet given Bill the nod that would solidify alliances. Thomas was aware of the fragility of his position. Work for Bill came with a promise of status, but only if Bill could get Vernon's attention. So Thomas's moves were pragmatic as well as personal. Was, in his own way, trying to ensure long-term stability for himself. He told himself that the present sacrifices were investments. Anyone who has ever been pressed by the need for security recognizes the logic. But investments ask for interest, and the interest here was paid in betrayal. Eva's open interest in Thomas made matters more combustible. She did not hide her flirtations. She wore them like a banner. Often, she would lean toward Thomas in rooms full of people, her laugh reaching just a fraction too loudly toward him. It was visible, palpable. She did not whisper about her feelings, she displayed them. The social effect of that was immediate. Friends rearranged themselves. People who had once been casual acquaintances recalculated their interactions. In a small lives ecosystem, this behavior was a natural kind of gravity. It pulled Thomas and left Kat feeling like loose change. Kat wondered, privately, whether the moral indictment that had been hurled at Eva by Leslie calling her a woman who took other people's men would happen again. Leslie, even before she vanished, had a history of confronting Eva, accusing her in a public, voice-sharp way of being a seductress, of stealing affection with the audacity of someone who saw men as prizes. Leslie's words had been brutal and final. She painted Eva as irreparable, as a woman who would dismantle other people's lives without seeing the wreckage. Kat knew the accusation because it had been thrown before, in a kitchen with wine and threats. Now, watching Eva with Thomas, Kat feared she would repeat Leslie's condemnation out of a wounded, exhausted reflex. She hated Leslie for having used that language and yet understood its temptation. When someone takes what is yours, The impulse is to name them a thief. There was also the question of whether Eva deserved the contempt that followed her like a rumor. It is easy to blame an agent and harder to blame a system that creates the appetite for transgression. Men like Tomas, so eager to perform roles, are also agents in the movement. Eva did not act in a vacuum. She moved toward a man who had made himself receptive to the idea of being more dangerous, more admired, more alive. The culpability, therefore, was distributed. Yet in the deliciously simple language of betrayal, complexity rarely finds its way. Kat felt both rage and pity. She felt rage for Thomas's failure to be present and pity for a cousin's friend who might, in some ways, be a mirror of the needs Thomas refused to see in Kat. All of this folded into the larger question: was Thomas right to go up against Dupree? In that calculus, the emotional and political worlds overlapped. If Thomas chose to pick a fight because Bill asked it, because he wanted a place in the hierarchy, that placed him in direct conflict with a man who had most likely broken others to build his territory. If Thomas won, his status might change. If he lost, he might lose everything: his position, his safety, and possibly his life. Kat knew that power plays were dangerous things. She had watched the small compromises men made in the name of ambition. That those compromises often involved women like her used as props, neglected in private, was a pattern she had catalogued with a bitterness that made her articulate and cold. A sense of inevitability began to thicken. Thomas's flirtation with danger, Eva's unashamed appetite, Kat's relentless search for Leslie, all of these catapulted the story toward a collision. The city, with its alleys and hum of indifferent buses, seemed to watch them. It gave the impression that the small dramas of private life were not isolated at all but entangled with larger currents of greed and power. Kat had once believed that love could be a simple thing. Now she understood it to be political material subject to manipulation and negotiation. She kept asking herself whether the man she loved had ever been the man she had needed. Thomas, in his kindness and predictability, had been comforting. He had not been a villain. He was flawed in ways that made him human. But in the arithmetic of human relations, being human sometimes equaled a kind of cruelty and inability to see when a partner needs fierce courage rather than careful comfort. Thomas was, perhaps, too busy seeking external validation to defend the fragile person sitting beside him on the dark nights. That was the wound, not that he loved someone else, but that he seemed to be aligning his loyalties with a world that did not have room for Kat's grief. And Kat, moving through the days as if through a fog, found that the truth of her feelings was not simple either. She was wounded and proud, feeding on rage and the righteous clarity of a woman who knows when a man has become small. She was also afraid. The patriarchal whisper that women are disposable hovered near. Who would choose her now? Who would stay when the tempos of her life were jagged by loss? The sexual and the political braided together until she could not tell which part of the betrayal hurt more: intimate, the social, or the existential. It occurred to Kat that the story was not merely about lovers and betrayals, it was about choices people make when confronted with pressure. Thomas's decisions were suggestions of what a man becomes when the prize of recognition is dangled in front of him. Eva's choices were revelations of a woman who wanted something and was willing to take the social scorn that often followed. Kat's choices were acts of survival: how to find a missing person, how to pick up her own dignity, how to decide whether to stay in a relationship that no longer fit the shape of who she was. In the nights that followed, the arrangement coalesced into an unbearable tension. Thomas spoke less and moved quicker, as if he were running through the small list of his duties. Eva smiled more openly. Kat folded maps and notes and received tips that went nowhere. The city continued its indifferent spin. Friends took sides silently. Some pitied, some judged. The possibility of a confrontation with Dupree hovered like a distant thunder, a storm on the horizon that could break everything into shards or wash the stains away. And so, with a conspiracy of small betrayals and grand ambitions in motion, the narrative tightened. Kat sat on the threshold of a decision she had not expected to have to make, whether to ask Thomas to choose or to leave the contest of his allegiances and protect herself. She could demand loyalty, But loyalty is not a thing you can buy with an ultimatum. It grows or it withers. The search for Leslie could not pause for a relationship to reassert itself. The search had to continue, and perhaps, in its relentless logic, it would expose truths no conversation could reach. This is where the story wrenches itself into orbit. Tomas, flirtatious with danger and more alive near Eva's light. Eva, an unapologetic force moving through the social world like a charge. Kat, a woman with a missing family member and a disintegrating love. The power struggle between Bill and Vernon, and the looming threat of Dupree. All these threads knotted together in ways that made the future precarious. Each character's next move would have consequences. None of it would be neat. None of it would be easily forgiven. The night the first real confrontation appears is not yet here. The pressure builds in small domestic betrayals, a message left unreplied, a dinner missed, a conversation cut off. Thomas's eyes, which once looked at Kat with something like sanctuary, are now quick and furtive, as if he is scanning for approval elsewhere. Eva's presence becomes less like a ripple and more like a tide. Bill paces and speaks of moves like chess pieces, and Tomas begins to perform his role with the kind of commitment that suggests a man willing to lose things for a larger prize. Kat watches all of this and understands the ugly arithmetic. You can be right about a man and still have your life altered by him. She has to make decisions that will not only change the shape of her relationship but will also unspool consequences for Leslie's search. The moral clarity she had once relied on is not a map. It is a compass that points only to the true north of her intention: find Leslie at all costs, and protect whatever remains of herself in the process. The rest: Tomas, Eva, Dupree, Bill, Vernon are pieces on a board where she must act with strategy as much as with heart. At the moment when she most needs someone to stand beside her, Tomas chooses not to. He chooses instead to reach for the excitement of an uncertain alliance with Eva and to step toward a battle with Dupree that might, in the end, consume everything. Kat feels the double burn of abandonment, by the man who had been her anchor, and by a world where her search and grief are not sufficient to command loyalty. She has to adjust, to strengthen, to imagine new tactics. The lines are drawn sharper now, and every conversation carries a weight it did not before. As the city hums on, a storm takes shape, emotional, political, and dangerously practical. Friendships will be tested, loyalties will tremble, and choices will have consequences that reach beyond the immediate. Kat stands, a woman with a missing cousin and a man who seems to be choosing a rival. She is hurt, furious, and determined. The story has not ended, it has gathered speed. The next moves will be decisive, not just for lovers but for power and survival in a place where alliances can mean salvation or ruin. The cliff edge waits, the characters gather at its rim, each holding a different version of what they want, what they fear, and what they are willing to lose.